My name is Elizabeth, and this summer at the age of 27, my life took a turn I never expected. It all began in early June when I decided to leave behind the bustling city life and spend a few months at my father's house in the countryside. I had always loved that place, the scent of pine trees, the serene mornings filled with birdsong, and the calm star-filled nights by the lake. It had always been a sanctuary where I could escape the stress of everyday life. But this time things were different. Before I arrived, my father had invited his best friend, Nick, and his wife to stay with him. They were going through a rough patch. Nick's business had recently gone bankrupt, and they were forced to sell their home. His wife, Catherine, was unwell and often stayed in her room, while my father was frequently away at work, leaving Nick and me alone in the house. Nick had always been a part of our family, tall, charismatic, with a deep voice that made you hang on to every word he said. He worked from home, often sitting in the living room with his laptop, and we began spending more and more time together. At first, our conversations were light and easy. We talked about the weather, books, music. But as the days passed, I felt something shifting between us. One evening, my father was working late again, and Catherine had gone to bed early. I happened to find Nick in the kitchen, making himself a cup of coffee. I suggested we sit on the terrace and enjoy the evening together. The air was warm and still, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming flowers. We sat side by side on the wooden bench, watching the sun slowly dip below the horizon. "You know," he said softly, his voice carrying a hint of something unspoken, "I didn't think I'd ever find peace again. Lately everything in my life has changed so quickly I can barely keep up." I turned to look at him, the golden light of the sunset casting shadows across his face. I wanted to say something comforting, something that would ease the weight he carried, but instead I reached out and touched his hand. It was a small, spontaneous gesture, but it changed everything. He held my gaze and I felt my heart begin to race. We sat there in silence, but the air between us was charged with something new. Something we both felt but were too afraid to acknowledge. For the next few days we tried to act as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't ignore the warmth in his eyes whenever he looked at me. And he too seemed unable to stay away. Our friendship slowly deepened into something more. We began talking late into the night, sharing secrets and dreams, fears and regrets. I felt like he truly saw me in a way no one else ever had. One evening, when my father was once again working late, I found Nick sitting alone in the living room, staring out the window. I teased him lightly about being so deep in thought and suggested we share a glass of wine. We laughed and reminisced about old times when I was just a little girl, and he would bring me chocolates whenever he visited my father. But then as our laughter died down, an intense silence filled the space between us. Without warning, he leaned closer. My breath caught in my throat as I felt the warmth of his presence. The kiss that followed was brief, tentative, almost as if we were testing the waters. But even that single kiss was enough to send my world spinning. Nick pulled away quickly, his eyes wide with shock. "Elizabeth, I'm sorry," he stammered. That was a mistake." I nodded, though inside every part of me screamed that it was the most right thing I had ever done. That night I lay in bed, my mind replaying the kiss over and over again. I couldn't stop thinking about how it felt to be close to him, to feel his lips on mine. We had crossed a line and there was no going back. The next morning we pretended like everything was normal, but there was no denying that things had changed between us. Every conversation, every accidental touch carried a weight that wasn't there before. We were both trying to navigate this new unspoken bond, knowing full well that we were playing a dangerous game. It was just the beginning of something that I couldn't yet fully understand, but I knew it would change everything. I tried to convince myself that it was just a kiss, a mistake, a fleeting moment of weakness that meant nothing. But as the days passed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The warmth of his lips, the way he looked at me right before it happened, as if I were the only person in the world. I knew I should forget it, bury the memory deep down and move on, but every time I saw Nick, it all came rushing back. We continued pretending that nothing had happened, but it was all just an illusion. Whenever we were in the same room, I could feel the air grow heavier, charged with something neither of us dared to acknowledge. Catherine, oblivious to what was happening, often stayed in her room resting. My father, as usual, was rarely home before late at night. This left Nick and me alone far too often, in a house that now felt like it held its breath every time we were together. One afternoon, I found myself in the garden, weeding the flower beds. The summer sun was blazing hot, and I was glad for the shade of the old oak tree that stood proudly at the edge of the lawn. Nick came outside, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He watched me for a moment, leaning against the doorway, before he walked over and handed me one of the glasses. I tried not to look at him, but I could feel his gaze lingering on me. "You've always had a green thumb," he said, his voice warm and almost teasing. "I remember you used to help your mother in the garden when you were just a little girl." His words brought a rush of memories, the soft laughter of my mother, the scent of roses and earth, the way the sun would filter through the leaves. I smiled, wiping the sweat from my brow. "Those were simpler times," I replied softly. "Everything seemed so much easier back then." He nodded, taking a sip of his tea. "Yeah, life seemed clearer, didn't it? Now it just feels like everything is a mess." There was something raw in his voice that pulled at my heart. Without thinking, I reached out and touched his arm. The moment my fingers brushed against his skin, I felt that same jolt of electricity that had sparked between us during our kiss. His eyes darkened, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me again, right there in the garden with the sun shining down on us. But instead he stepped back, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to shake off whatever spell we were under. "We shouldn't," he murmured, his voice strained. "Elizabeth, we can't keep doing this." "I know," I whispered, my heart aching even as I said the words. "But it's so hard to stop." From that moment on, it was as if we were dancing on the edge of a knife, each step threatening to send us both tumbling into something we couldn't control. Our conversations grew deeper, more intimate. We spoke of things we had never told anyone else. His fears of failure, my longing to escape the confines of a life that felt too small for me. And each time we spoke, I felt myself falling deeper, wanting him more with every passing day. One evening, when my father was out late for a business dinner and Catherine was in her room resting, Nick and I found ourselves alone in the cozy den. A summer storm had rolled in, and rain was lashing against the windows, filling the room with a soft, rhythmic sound. We were sitting close, almost too close, on the old leather sofa. He was telling me about a trip he had taken to Italy years ago, before everything in his life had fallen apart. "I'd always dreamed of taking Catherine there," he said quietly, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace. "But things just never worked out. Now, I don't know if they ever will." There was a sadness in his voice that made my heart clench. I reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. He turned to look at me, and the intensity in his gaze took my breath away. Before I could think better of it, I leaned in and kissed him. This time there was no hesitation. He kissed me back with a desperation that was almost painful, as if he had been holding back for too long and couldn't stand it any longer. His hands found their way to my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, forgetting everything. Catherine, my father, the risks we were taking. It was just us in that moment, lost in each other. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, he pulled away. This has to stop," he said, his voice thick with regret. "Elizabeth, we're playing with fire." I could see the torment in his eyes, the struggle between what he wanted and what he knew was right. And yet, even as he spoke those words, his fingers lingered on my arm, unwilling to let go. "I don't want to stop," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I can't." He closed his eyes as if pained by my confession. But then he let out a sigh, and I knew he felt the same. We were both trapped, caught in something far bigger than ourselves. After that night, we became even more careful, more secretive. But the longing between us only grew stronger. We would steal moments together whenever we could. A touch of hands in the hallway, a quick kiss in the shadows of the garden, whispered confessions late at night. It was intoxicating, addictive, and utterly unsustainable. One afternoon, we decided to meet in the woods behind the house. It was a place where no one would think to find us, hidden away from prying eyes. We walked along the narrow path, our fingers intertwined, our laughter echoing through the trees. It was the first time in weeks that I felt truly happy. But just as we were about to leave, we heard a sound, the crunch of leaves, a twig snapping. My heart leapt into my throat. We turned to see Catherine standing at the edge of the clearing, her eyes wide with confusion. For a moment I was sure she had seen everything, that our secret was out. But then she simply smiled weakly and said she had been looking for Nick. My breath came out in a shaky sigh of relief as she turned and walked away. We had dodged a bullet, but it was a warning. A reminder that what we were doing was playing with more than just our own hearts. That night I lay awake, the guilt gnawing at me. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that we needed to stop, that this could only end in disaster, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let him go. Summer was slipping away faster than I could hold on to it. Each day melting into the next in a blur of heat, stolen moments, and whispered secrets. I woke up every morning with the bittersweet thrill of knowing that I would see him again, even if it was just for a few fleeting minutes. The forbidden nature of our relationship made every touch, every glance feel electric, as if we were both on the verge of something dangerous, something we couldn't control. But in the midst of it all, there was a nagging fear that our fragile world could shatter at any moment. Catherine had become more aware of my presence in the house. Maybe it was just my paranoia, but I started to notice the way her eyes lingered on me, the unspoken questions that hung in the air whenever we found ourselves alone in a room. She was still recovering from her illness, spending most of her days in bed or quietly reading in the study. But sometimes when she came downstairs to join us for dinner, her gaze would dart between me and Nick, as if she sensed the unspoken tension that pulsed between us like a heartbeat. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a dusky pink, I found myself alone in the library. It had always been one of my favorite rooms in my father's house. The scent of old books, the creak of the wooden floor, the way the light slanted through the windows in the late afternoon. I had come here to clear my mind, to remind myself of who I was before Nick, before everything had become so complicated. But of course he found me. I heard the door creak open behind me, and without turning around, I knew it was him. My heart skipped a beat, a familiar rush of excitement flooding through me. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway watching me. "Elizabeth," he finally said, his voice low and soft, almost a whisper. "I can't keep doing this. Hiding, lying. It's tearing me apart." I turned to face him, and the look in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. There was something raw and desperate in his expression, something that mirrored the chaos I felt inside. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I felt the same, that I was torn between what I knew was right and what my heart so desperately wanted. But the words wouldn't come. He crossed the room in a few quick strides, reaching for me, and before I knew it, his arms were around me. His embrace was warm and familiar, yet filled with an urgency that hadn't been there before. I could feel his breath against my neck, and I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the moment, forgetting everything else. In that instant, nothing else mattered. But just as quickly, he pulled back, his hands dropping to his sides. His face was etched with guilt, and he looked away as if ashamed of himself. "We're being reckless, Elizabeth," he said, his voice shaking. "I can't keep betraying Catherine like this. She doesn't deserve it." Hearing her name was like a bucket of cold water poured over me. The reality of what we were doing hit me with full force. I could feel my eyes burning with unshed tears, but I forced myself to stay composed. I knew he was right, but the thought of ending whatever it was we had, this intoxicating, passionate connection that had taken root between us, was more than I could bear. "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "but I don't know how to stop." We stood there in silence, the tension between us almost unbearable. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, my heart in pieces. For the next few days he avoided me. I would catch glimpses of him in the hallways or out in the garden, but he would quickly turn away before I could approach him. It was agonizing, this sudden distance after weeks of growing so close. I spent my nights tossing and turning, replaying every conversation, every kiss, wondering if it was truly over. Then one afternoon, when I couldn't bear the silence any longer, I decided to confront him. Catherine had gone to the city for a doctor's appointment, and my father was, as usual, stuck at work. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I found Nick in the garden, crouched down by the rose bushes, pretending to be busy. "Nick," I called softly, stepping closer. He didn't look up, his hands stilling over the soil. "We can't just pretend like nothing happened," I continued, my voice wavering. You can't just shut me out like this. He finally turned to face me, his eyes filled with a torment that mirrored my own. What do you want me to say, Elizabeth? He asked, his voice tight with emotion. That I can't stop thinking about you? That I want you every second of every day? Because it's true, but it doesn't change the fact that this is wrong. Does it feel wrong? I shot back, my own frustration bubbling to the surface. Because every time you look at me, every time you touch me, it feels like the most real thing in my life. For a moment I thought he was going to walk away again, but instead he reached for me, pulling me into a desperate, searing kiss that took my breath away. This time there was no hesitation, no holding back. It was as if we were both drowning, clinging to each other as if we were the only thing keeping ourselves afloat. We made love that afternoon in the garden, hidden by the tall hedges that surrounded us. It was frantic, urgent, like we were trying to capture every moment before it was taken away from us. The air was thick with the scent of roses and earth, and for those stolen moments, it felt like nothing else existed. It was only us, caught up in a whirlwind of desire and longing. But reality came crashing back far too soon. As we lay there, catching our breath, I heard the distant sound of a car pulling up the driveway. Panic shot through me like a bolt of lightning. Catherine had returned earlier than expected. Nick's face went pale and we scrambled to fix our clothes, to erase any evidence of what had just happened. I could hear Catherine's voice calling out as she entered the house, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. We managed to slip back inside through the side door, just in time to see Catherine coming down the hallway. She smiled warmly when she saw us, completely unaware of the storm that had just taken place in her absence. I forced myself to smile back, but inside I was unraveling. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. It was only a matter of time before we were caught, before everything came crashing down. And yet, despite the guilt, despite the fear, I couldn't stop wanting him. I couldn't stop loving him. But even as I clung to those stolen moments, a part of me knew that it couldn't last forever. The walls were closing in on us, and sooner or later, everything we had would come tumbling down. The house had turned into a cage. Each day, the walls seemed to close in a little tighter around us, and the tension was suffocating. Catherine was still oblivious, or at least she pretended to be. But I could feel her eyes lingering on us for a second too long during dinner, her questions more probing whenever she caught me alone. My father was too busy with work to notice anything amiss, but I could sense that something was shifting in the air. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Nick and I had grown reckless. The fear of being caught was always there, gnawing at us, but it was like an addiction we couldn't escape. Every glance, every touch, every secret kiss only made me want him more. But the weight of what we were doing, betraying a sick wife, deceiving my father, was becoming harder to ignore. Guilt gnawed at me in the dark hours of the night, but in the heat of the moment, when his hands were on me, all that guilt melted away. It was a vicious cycle, one that left me torn between desire and shame. One late afternoon, when the house was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, everything finally unraveled. My father had unexpectedly returned home early, earlier than he ever had before. Nick and I were in the library, hidden in the shadowy corner between the old bookshelves, our lips locked in a kiss that felt like it might be our last. I remember the way his hands trembled as he held me, the way his breath hitched when I whispered his name. But then the door creaked open. The sound sent a jolt of fear through me, and we sprang apart like guilty children. My father stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of confusion, disbelief, and something far darker. I had never seen him look at me like that before. As if I were a stranger, someone he no longer recognized. What the hell is going on here? His voice was sharp like the crack of a whip, and the room seemed to shrink around us. I opened my mouth to explain, to come up with some kind of excuse, but the words died in my throat. Nick stepped forward, his face ashen, his hands raised as if to calm my father. "Thomas, it's not what it looks like," Nick began, but even as he spoke, he knew it was a lie. The truth hung between us like a blade, ready to fall. "Don't you dare lie to me," my father spat, his voice shaking with fury. "I trusted you, Nick. You were like a brother to me. And you?" He turned to me, his eyes blazing with a mix of betrayal and heartbreak. "How could you? I had never seen my father so angry, so devastated. It was like watching him crumble before my eyes, and the guilt that had been simmering in the background all summer came crashing down on me like a tidal wave. I wanted to run to him to beg for his forgiveness, but my feet were rooted to the floor, my body paralyzed with shame. Nick tried to reach out to him, but my father's expression hardened. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and final. "I don't ever want to see you in my house again." The words cut through the air like a knife. Nick turned to me, his eyes desperate, but there was nothing either of us could say to undo what had been done. I watched as my father's best friend, the man I had fallen for, the man who had made me feel more alive than I ever had before, walked out of my life. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone to face the wreckage we had created. That night, my father didn't speak to me. He couldn't even look at me. The silence in the house was deafening, and I wished more than anything that I could turn back time, erase everything and make things right. But it was too late for that. The damage was done. The next morning my father made his decision. He came into my room, his face pale and drawn, the lines of his age deeper than I had ever seen them. He handed me a train ticket and a piece of paper with an address on it. "You're leaving today," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I've arranged for you to stay with your aunt in the city. She knows a family with a son. A good man. You're going to put this behind you, Elizabeth. You're going to start over." I tried to protest, to explain, to apologize, but he cut me off with a look so cold it made my heart freeze in my chest. "I can't bear to look at you right now," he said quietly. "You've destroyed everything." Those words echoed in my mind as I packed my things, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip up my suitcase. I had lost everything, my home, my father's trust, and the man who had become my world in such a short time. The thought of starting a new life, of being forced into a marriage with someone I didn't know, made me feel sick. But I had no choice. My father had made his decision, and I was powerless to change it. As the train pulled away from the station, I looked out the window, watching as the town that had once been my sanctuary faded into the distance. My heart ached with the finality of it all. I had ruined everything, not just my own life but the lives of those around me. I thought of Nick, wondering where he was, if he had returned to Catherine, if he was as lost as I was. Part of me wanted to believe that he would find me, that we would somehow find a way to be together again. But I knew it was a foolish dream. We had destroyed too much, hurt too many people. The train rumbled on, carrying me toward an uncertain future. I didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. The summer that had started so innocently had turned into a whirlwind that had swept away everything I had once held dear. And now all I had left were memories, bittersweet, beautiful and laced with regret.